Welcome to the Bodcast episode 10. Today on the podcast, we are honored to be joined by Victoria Felkar, and we're going to be talking all about the menstrual cycle. Victoria is an amazing educator and researcher, working across a multitude of fields from kinesiology to sports medicine and the humanities. She's currently working on her doctorate on women's health and female hormone manipulation within sport medicine. Victoria, we love on your website how you call yourself explorer, renegade, advocate, and that you enjoy meditating with your dog in your spare time.
I sure do.
We know you've been on so many podcasts and you've lectured around the world that we're truly grateful that you are joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's always kind of weird to hear all the stuff that I've done, because when you're in the trenches, it's just day in and day out, I'm looking at books and writing papers. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, we were talking before the podcast, and like your research is fascinating. So are you almost done with your PhD?
I am. So I'm in the writing phase right now. And I think it's one of those misperceptions that maybe I had. I know other PhD students have had it too. You forget you have to write a book. Right. It's like you do all this really cool research and papers, but then the final product is essentially it's a book. And so I'm writing right now. And I will be the first to admit could lecture every day for the rest of my life and speak, but writing for me is definitely, I know I'm really good at it, but it's like pulling teeth. It's not my favorite thing to spend my time.
I know. Well, that's hard. I mean, has COVID been a bit of a blessing in that you've sort of had more time to do this?
Not really, to be honest. I have been really dedicated and kind of changed my life around to facilitate me just writing for the last year and a half or so. And so with COVID, it really didn't change my day-to-day that much, because I'm like, okay, I'm getting up and writing today. Like that's about the same. There's been some hiccups in access to certain resources because libraries have been closed all over the world. So if I had to go back to get something from like an archive or consult with somebody in a certain laboratory, I haven't been able to do that. But for the most part, I've just been in solitary writing for the last year and a half of my life. So it's no different there.
Gosh,
Huge life. Yeah, that's loads of writing, man.
What got you into your PhD?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to break it down. So I was a female athlete myself. I was a classical ballet dancer growing up. It started probably before I could walk. I was about 2.5. And I competed. We started competing at 5. And so I was, a young female in a very athletic world. I did part-time school. That was my life. But I also had I was like any female, I went through hormonal changes as I reached puberty. And I had some hormonal health difficulties because of that. My doctor at the time, his solution was to put me on the oral contraceptive pill as a way to regulate my menstrual cycle. Now, unfortunately, I also had an eating disorder, which is another very prevalent thing with young female dancers. And I was overtraining. I was dancing, 5-6 hours a day, plus I was long distance running. And then I actually even started lifting at 15. So my body went through a lot at a very young age. And as a result of that, a few years later, when I went off the pill, I was like, I think I was healthy and really hopeful to be able to maintain a normal, big quotes, menstrual cycle. It didn't happen for me. And so at first doctors told me, don't worry. And I was like, no, that doesn't seem like the right answer, but okay. And then about a year and a half later, my body just broke down. And at that time, I was actually in university. I was going through to go into medicine. And that was really scary for me because I had so many different specialist doctors that I went to, and nobody knew what was wrong with me. There was a bunch of different diagnoses, from brain tumors to this is just you. And that was really scary for me, because what made it a unique case is that I was an active female. And the solution for a lot of the doctors was stop exercising. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, if I stop exercising, I'm going to go crazy. Like, that's not a treatment plan that you should be giving me, especially because I was in kinesiology, learning about how, brilliant human movement is for the body. And so things just didn't make sense to me. Luckily, I was able to get paired up with a very brilliant physician, actually down in Ohio in the States. And he really worked through a lot of the stuff with me, because ultimately what we found out was that I didn't go through puberty properly, because I got put on the pill so young, and I was so active. And so I shut down a bunch of different signals in my body that I actually needed to develop properly. And so as a result, when I was 18, my immune system erupted and chaos happened. I got really sick. I mean, my voice dropped. I started growing hair places. I didn't have a period. And then I had a crazy thing. So it was terrifying for me. But during that time, I realized that in my education, there wasn't information on this. And what was there was so limited. It was based around a very small kind of diagnoses in female athletes. And it was something that I kind of started to question, going on, I don't think that's actually the way it works. And so off I went, and my mentor said to me, he was like, you know what, if you want to create change, you got to go into research, not into medicine. Because as a medical practitioner, you're not going to be able to do what you need to do with your career. And that was that. And I've been doing it ever since. I started lifting very young, which is an absolute blessing. I fell in love with the weights at 15, but I've seen a lot of good and bad in this industry as a result of that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, that's intense, being put on the pill at such a young age without. It didn't seem like it had an end goal. It's like, just let's see where it takes you. And I'm sure it must have been hard in terms of, even with your peers and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I've been in this field that I am now, where I consult with women around the world and practitioners and educators. And I'm a consultant. And I speak to hundreds of people by this point in time. And that the more I learned, the more I found that it's not an unnormal thing to have happen, especially to female athletes, where suddenly the oral contraceptive pill becomes this catch-all solution to a relatively normal physiological function. When women are going through puberty, it's a little bit chaotic. Same thing when men are going through puberty. Their hormones are here and there and everywhere, because you're literally laying the foundation for your reproductive system and other systems of your body. It's not supposed to be like a very linear, like A plus B plus C plus D. It's not supposed to be like that, because that's not the way the human body works. And so unfortunately, though, with the female, especially the adolescent female body, that can become pathologized. It gets seen as being, a heavy bleed is seen as something that is very worthy of medical treatment, when the reality is that for some women is what happens at first. And it's not, I don't like to even label it as good or bad. It kind of just is one of those things where that is. Now, if it is absolutely destructive and something is not, it's really kind of changing the way that individual can live, well, then we got to start to address it. But that shouldn't be through hormonal means, when your body is trying to learn how to make its own hormones. It's such a counterproductive process, but it's so common. And it's not just common in adolescence, it's common throughout the life course, whether it's women going through menopause or women who are trying to regain a regular menstrual cycle after they've, say, been pregnant. And so the pill gets used for so many different things beyond contraceptive purposes. I don't even like to actually call it that. It's funny, with my research, I get a lot of slack for that, because people go like, why do you have to make this so complicated? I'm like, well, because what you're doing is you're giving somebody synthetic estrogen and synthetic progesterone. you're not that at the base of it, that's what you're doing. It's just marketed in this one single pill in specific amounts. But what you're doing is you're giving their body a pharmaceutical steroid. That's what you're doing. It is a steroid at the end of the day. And that sometimes it's given orally, sometimes it's injections, sometimes it's patches, sometimes it's implants, sometimes it's vaginal IUDs, so actually in the uterine itself, so a vaginal insert. Sometimes that can be done through, so anyway, long story short, there's just a bunch of different ways that they can do it. The pill is just the most common though, because it's the easiest. But even within that, there's lots of different types of hormones that women can get. There's different durations of use. There's different actual amounts of hormones that are being prescribed. And so it's not personalized. Often it's not even what the individual needs, because the use of those hormones, it actually shuts down your body's ability to make its own hormones. It is like a light switch where you shut down the connections between your brain, your ovaries. It castrates, it's done. You turn that off. And that has very, very, very big implications for individuals.
Yeah, and
medicine just doesn't talk about them.
Well, that's right. Like, there's no, you're just told to go on the pill. You're not told about anything else or what can happen, or that it's a steroid. I mean, if someone told you were taking steroids, you'd be like, no, I'm not. And just seems like there's just not, like we were saying before, that considering this, this is part of, thousands of years, millions of years of evolution, there's that not really that much known. But a lot of gaps.
Huge gaps. And some of that has to do with just the gaps in knowledge around the menstrual cycle itself. So with I love history. So I always kind of go back and go like, well, how long have we actually known these ideas for? So, we knew that women have menstrual cycles. We didn't actually know what was happening on a hormonal level until around the 1920s, 1930s. And since then, there's been a lot of shifts. And so, my grandparents were born in the 1920s. That's not that long ago when you think about it. And at the same time that they were developing knowledge about the menstrual cycle, they also developed pill, the basis of the hormones that were used to treat it. So you were learning about the molecule estrogen, the molecule progesterone, and the molecule testosterone. And at the same time, they were developing the synthetic versions of them for treatment. And so these two things developed parallel to each other. And so with the ideas around menstruation itself, though, there was a lot of ideas that weren't the best that kind of got wrapped into that theory, that medical theory, and it still gets used today. And unfortunately for the fitness industry, they've latched onto that and ran very fast and far ahead and have not looked back. And a lot of women are being disserviced because of it. And I see that with my career every day, that women get either told to do certain types of programming, or certain things get ignored, or they just don't have the general awareness. And I don't think that it's anybody's fault. Somebody could point the finger at a coach and be like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. But at the end of the day, there's such bad knowledge about this stuff that all we can do is just accept that there's a lot of bad knowledge and try to do better.
Do you think the reason for the, say, let's call it bad knowledge is due to, say, taboo? Maybe guys don't like talking about the women's cycle, even you'd see in homes, when the boy is growing up, everyone is like, yeah, he's becoming a man, but when it's happening to the girl, it's like no one really wants to talk about it. It's like, go talk to your mother, that's woman stuff. So
absolutely,
one of the big reasons why research is so limited, or no one has really, until you taken so much interest in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only is sport very, very gendered in terms of the fact that you have a lot of men in positions of power, so coaches or team representatives or the trainers. So we have that aspect, and that ultimately, at least when I went to school, it's not like I was learning about the menstrual cycle in grade 12 biology class. And if I did, it was maybe like the bare bones basis. And even in my master's degree, so I did a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and a PhD, there's not a lot of stuff on the female reproductive cycle in exercise physiology. Advanced exercise physiology, you're not getting that information. So absolutely, there's that aspect that there's just not this conversation about it. And why that is, well, you hit the nail on the head. It's one of those conversations that kind of has become very much like silenced, like hush hush, this is a woman's issue, women need to deal with it. Unfortunately, that's the furthest thing from the truth, that it's actually, you know, it's really important for us to understand human biology and physiology for all people, not just based off of your age or your gender or your sex. And so that is a really big piece. And that is also a big piece of, I mean, the history, going back to the history is just so complicatedly crazy, and I couldn't even make it up if I wanted to. It's stranger than fiction, with the certain individuals' ideas that got accepted and other people's that didn't, and how big pharma was paying for research and then also giving money, like making pills. Like, it's just, it would be the weirdest movie if I could make it, because people would not believe that it was true. Right. And then in the context of sport, it's even more messed up, because one of the reasons, for example, women weren't allowed to participate in sport was because of their menstrual cycles. So here's something that it was used to prohibit women from participating in sport, and not that long ago. And in some cultures still prohibits women from participating in sport. And so how can we create knowledge about something that we choose to be ignorant about?
It's just fascinating and mind-blowing that it's, you know, that is still the case.
Absolutely.
Well, should we just look at the menstrual cycle in more detail then? Yeah. I don't really want to say normal, but what does a sort of a healthy menstrual cycle look like?
Yeah. So the healthy menstrual cycle, and I might say this a lot, and I apologize, but it's really complicated what goes into the healthy menstrual cycle. It's not as simple as you see. If you were to Google and, you know, menstrual cycle, you would get this cute little diagram, of certain types of, it almost looks like a graph of things going highs and lows. And first and foremost, that's actually an incorrect representation of what the hormones are doing. So number one, okay, I would say 99.9% of those graphs that you see are wrong. The data that they've used is incorrect. So that aside, what happens for the menstrual cycle, what's actually going on is you have these interwoven layers of hormonal regulation that causes an end result. And often the end result that people think about is a bleed. That, though, is really not the end result that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on something called ovulation, because ovulation is how the body is able to maintain a healthy hormonal state. But let's go back to the very beginning. So ovarian hormones, typically speaking, people think of two main ones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, that is a very simplified view. There's a lot more going on there. You've got testosterone, there's different forms of estrogen. There's these various kind of cascades of highs and lows happening, not only within our ovaries itself. You also have things happening in your endometrium. You also have signals being sent from your brain, so your hypothalamus and your pituitary. But then that also gets influenced by other parts of the body, like your thyroid, like levels of, say, iron. So if you're anemic, that influences your menstrual cycle, like psychological stress. So there is so many different things that influence these cyclical patterns of hormonal fluctuations. So not only do we have a lot of things happening, but there's a lot of things that can influence it. So the normal, and again, big air quotes, menstrual cycle typically it includes something called an ovarian cycle. which that is a repetitive development of your follicles, an ovulation process as well, and then also something called a corpus luteum breakdown or demise. And then you also have an endometrial cycle, and that's the proliferation or the building up of the endometrium, and then different glands that are kind of receiving information. And then if all that goes well, and you also have sperm involved, we create conception, we create babies. That's the biggest difference between the bodies of men and women, is women create babies. That is, and it's a phenomenal thing when you think about it, that our body creates life.
Yeah.
Blows my mind.
Yeah.
It blows my mind, and I've been doing this for a
My daughter
decade.
gets born, and it's a miracle. It's just a miracle.
Absolutely. Now, if you don't have conception, there's a shedding of a layer in your endometrium that it results in the bleed or the menstrual cycle that people often think about. So this process of all these different signals being sent and feedback loops and things breaking down and things building, although historically we've said that this happens in 28 days, it's actually a huge degree of variance, not only within individuals, but also across women. So the average length, typically speaking, could be 27 to even 34 days. Some women's longer than that, and some women that's shorter than that. And it varies so much. Within this kind of cycle, this process that's happening, there are, typically speaking, kind of like two main phases. One is called the follicular phase, and one is called the luteal phase. And it's a very simplistic way to describe it, but it works for, especially for our purposes, when I don't have I can't show my graphs and everything else. So use my whiteboard to draw pictures. So the follicular phase is, typically speaking, when estrogen is highest. And the process of estrogen working with some pituitary peptides as well, or hormones. There's different processes that happen that lead to this process called ovulation. Once ovulation happens, and that happens at mid-cycle, then we open into the luteal phase, or kind of like the part 2 of our menstrual cycle. And that's when progesterone is highest and estrogen, it's still being created, which is number one thing that you see wrong with those charts, is they show estrogen being bottomed out at 0. Estrogen is still there. And that though progesterone is at its peak, and then progesterone starts to drop, estrogen drops, and that's when we have our bleed or our menses. During menses, the whole cycle starts over again. So the beginning of the menstrual cycle actually starts when somebody starts their bleed. Day 1 is day 1 of the menstrual cycle, because after that, a bunch of hormones kick up again, estrogen goes back up, you go back into your follicular phase, that carries out to mid-cycle, ovulation, ovulation goes into luteal, luteal goes back to the beginning, and we have this cycle that gets repeated when most women multiple times throughout their life course, and that no 2 cycles are often the same for the entire duration of their life course. Some women have differences in duration. Some women have little things that go astray. Ovulation is a really complicated process for our body to do, and that it is actually relatively common, especially within the athletic population, to have ovulatory disturbances, which means you don't actually make enough progesterone, or you don't make any at all, yet you still bleed. So people, they're called silent ovulatory disturbances, because often people don't even realize that something's not actually going the normative way. And it's really important that we ovulate, because that's how we create most of the progesterone in our body. If we don't ovulate, we don't create most of the progesterone. So that is huge to know that. If you don't create progesterone over time, there's consequences for that. No different than if somebody has high testosterone or low testosterone, high estrogen or low estrogen. For women, because that process is so important, we really should know a lot more and talk about it a lot more, but unfortunately we don't, because we focus on the bleed. That's the biggest thing and the biggest variable involved with the menstrual cycle. And while it is really important, I really try to get that across to people, that ovulation is critical. And that literally means the release of the egg from the ovary. And this process is key because this is what leads to pregnancy if there is conception. Now, if there isn't, it leads to the creation of progesterone. And so that kind of there's like that coordination of kind of events that lead to that process. It involves our brain, it involves our ovaries, it involves our endometrium, but it also involves the environment within our body and the environment outside of our body. One of the biggest reasons why women don't ovulate is stress, and stress of all types. And it's a very kind of, if I look at it from a very evolutionary perspective, why would a woman's body want to make a baby if she's stressed? Yeah. Whether that's too much food, too little food, too much training, too little training, not enough money, social stress, breakups, death, grief, or things internally like, like I mentioned before, anemia, or certain types of nutritional deficiencies, certain types of imbalances, whether that's with their thyroid, or say they've got a gastric ulcer and they're not actually able to absorb their food properly. And then their body senses they're starved when they're not because they're eating. There's so many different nuances and complications with this that get forgotten within not only medicine, but within the physical fitness world, because they don't talk about ovulation. They talk about the bleed as being the most important thing.
Yeah, and I guess that gets confusing because if you think you're healthy and you bleed, but like you say, you might not be ovulating, and
absolutely.
And then progesterone has so many other benefits.
Huge amounts, and that's where it gets confusing for a lot of people, because we've become almost so in tune to this. Like, if I'm bleeding, I'm good. Yeah. If it's happening at the same time every month, I'm good. If it's happening for the same amount of days, I'm good. If it's about the same volume, I'm good. And it's so important to know that that's only a small piece of what's happening at the end of the day. And that there are many different things that can cause kind of periods to go like bump, to not actually go the way that they're supposed to go. Mm-hmm. So you can have a shortened phase. So remember how I said that at mid-cycle is when you go from follicular to luteal. Well, some people can have a shorter luteal phase, meaning that they ovulated not at mid-cycle, but a little bit too close to when they started to bleed. Mm-hmm. Some people can have an extended luteal phase, meaning that instead of it being, say, somebody has a 14 or a 28-day menstrual cycle, and day 14 is when they should ovulate, all of a sudden they're ovulating at day 14, but they might not have a bleed until day 40. So we now have we've got an extra 12 days there, which extends that luteal phase. You can also not make enough progesterone. Mm-hmm. You can have imbalances with estrogen as well, high or low. You can also have imbalances like high or low progesterone. You can have the timing being off in terms of one cycle, you have 28-day, and then you have a 32, and then you have a 40, and then you got nothing for a couple months, and then it comes back, but it's only really light, and you don't really know what's going on. That is one of the biggest things I work with when I work with women, is that is their menstrual cycle. Mm-hmm. And for them, that's the way it's always been. That is their normal. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that normal is good or bad or right or wrong. That's their normal. And it's working with that individual to work through that, to actually figure out what's happening with their hormones, with the signaling, with other systems in their body. Because if that's just them, especially as an athlete, where things are crazy and chaotic, then we need to optimize that to the best of our ability. But if I were to regulate that person and say like, okay, my goal is for you to have a 28-day cycle every single month, that might actually be detrimental to their health. That could be detrimental to their performance, because that's not what their body needs and wants to do. All of us are unique. All of us are different. And we have to be open to that by understanding what's actually happening on the inside.
So what kind of irregularities would you suggest a woman to go and get some help, like from someone like?
Yeah. So I'm of the opinion that as women and as men, because it's important for you guys too, we need to understand what's happening with the menstrual cycle and pay attention. to the signs, the triggers of what's actually going on. So I think it is so important for women to have a consciousness of this and to track. I call it health literacy, that you are paying attention to the ebbs and flows of what your hormones are doing, your reproductive hormones in particular, and you're keeping note of that. And so it involves things like tracking your flow, which a lot of women now are starting to do. Basal metabolic temperature. So cool thing about progesterone is it increases your body temperature. So by taking your temperature with just a basic thermometer, first thing in the morning without, drinking or doing anything, you can chart your temperature throughout the duration of your menstrual cycle to actually see whether or not you are ovulating. How cool is that? But you don't hear people talking about that within fitness.
Yeah, true.
And it is actually often more accurate than doing lab work.
Oh, wow.
Because lab work, we have to time it at the right time to be able to know what or where their hormones are supposed to be, and then compare what their lab results are to that. If somebody has an irregular cycle, that's next to impossible to do.
Yeah.
And so tracking something like a basal temperature, super cool, super important. Even tracking things like discharge and cervical mucus, very important. Breast pain and nipple sensitivity, headaches, mood disturbances, even just quality of life, which for athletes, it can become a really good tool because they can start to see patterns and trends if you do this over time. I often suggest that women start with a goal of just say, I'm like, do it for 3 months. That, because you need to do it more than 1 month. So I'm like, do it for 3 months, track these variables, and then let's take a step back and let's actually look at your personal data to see what's going on. And then from there, we can make adjustments to either say you're having cramps. We can make adjustments to then figure out what we need to do to mitigate and manage those. Because at the end of the day, women and men need to know that the menstrual cycle is not supposed to be debilitating. It should not be crippling. You should not have raging mood swings. You should not be so tired you can't get out of bed. You should not have so much cramps that you cannot function. Now, a little bit of these things is normal. We all go through them. Men, women alike. We have fluctuations of our hormones. They're going to make us have more energy or have lower energy or have a higher mood or have a lower mood. Like, these are the ebbs and flows that's part of being human. But it's when these things become debilitating is when we need to stop, take a step back and ask, what do we need to do to actually create a more stable environment? The last thing that most people need is to throw a bunch of hormones into the mix. You've already got a hormonal imbalance going on. That's not the way we fix it. At least not the first thing we do. There's a lot of other things because, as I mentioned, there's so many variables that influence the menstrual cycle. Sleep, huge for the menstrual cycle, massively huge. If your sleep is messed up, guess what? You are opening yourself up to a world of hate when it comes to having a healthy menstrual cycle. If you are training, say you're at a higher training cycle, well, you've got to acknowledge that might have an impact on your menstrual cycle. So keep an eye open for that. If you're all of a sudden, say, going through a really stressful time in your life, that might impact your menstrual cycle. So try to put things in place to actually help you bring your nervous system down. Breathing practices, even so important at regulating your nervous system. It interacts with that menstrual cycle. It's actually called, instead of just the endocrine system, it's called the neuroendocrine system, because your nervous system impacts your ability to create and make and bind hormones. And those two things work serendipitously together. And so keeping a toll on all that, I know I kind of probably went off tangent there, but you give me a one question, I just run with it a lot. So always feel free to reel me back in.
It's just so interesting in how, I guess it's just human nature to, rather than look at your sleep or your stress, it's like you said, just, throw some more hormones at it, or the solution is to go on the pill, or that women think that what they're going through is normal, when in fact it is debilitating, and that's not how how it has to be.
Yeah. And it often gets trivialized. It's like, oh, well, you're just on your menstrual cycle. And it's like, no, if you open yourself up to learning what's your normal, you can judge if that's right or wrong or good or bad for you. I mean, I always give the example of like an athlete, let's say she's, somebody training for a fitness competition, and their whole life they've had this very regular menstrual cycle. And all of a sudden, in that last month before the show, they don't get it. I will have a lot of women that will come to me being like, oh my God, like, this is not good. Or I'll have women that go like, oh, this is totally normal. It's fine. And I'm like, okay, let's meet in the middle here. We have to acknowledge that what you're doing is a huge amount of stress on your body. So it's likely that this might be a kind of side effect of sorts of engaging in the activities that are required to step on stage as a fitness athlete. However, it's not necessarily the best thing. It has implications for you. So we don't want to be here forever. Mm-hmm. We might say like, okay, menstrual cycle gets thrown off for, let's say, 2 to 3 months during that kind of competitive peak. But then after that, if it's not coming back, we got to start to step up our game and make some changes. Not only that, is we can be doing things throughout the entire prep, so that's not as likely to happen.
Yeah, on that, I see a lot of women, they go from show to show. They do like be super lean for like almost 12 months and never have an off season.
Yeah.
What is the long-term impact on the menstrual cycle of literally having no cycle, no ovulation for a protracted period of time?
Yeah. So great question. See this all the time with my line of work. So it can be, so the biggest issue is you're not actually in a healthy state if that's happening. You might feel like you are, but if you're not having the proper hormonal creation, that has impact. A great example is your bone health. So your bones, our bones, women's bones, we have a very important impact of estrogen and progesterone. If you're not creating progesterone, you're not preserving the bone that you're making. You might only be 30 years old right now, but you're creating and preserving your bone for once you go through menopause and you're no longer making those hormones. You have a very limited amount of years to make and safeguard your skeletal system. Mm-hmm. Wow. And if you don't do it in that period of time, good luck, Chuck, if once you hit menopause, unless you're going to go on hormone therapy, but ultimately you have this set period of time for something like even reproductive function. So the ability to actually conceive. For some individuals, it gets harder the longer that you are, have either an anovulatory cycle or complete amenorrhea, which is no bleed. Mm-hmm. A lot of that also relates to like your period. I always use the word period to mean time, and I talk about periods. I got to stop doing that. So it also relates to the phase of time when you were going through puberty itself. So that age of, let's say, around 13 to 18 years old. So if during that time you did not create the proper kind of foundation for your reproductive life cycle, it is really hard to get your menstrual cycle regulated once you lose it in your reproductive prime, which would be about that 18 to 20 years old, all the way till perimenopause. Mm-hmm. So that's the time that your body is like, it's supposed to be making and creating hormones and making a place for babies to actually exist. And I hate that I always bring it back to fertility, because it's not all about fertility. I mean, there's lots of women that they don't want kids. And I mean, I'm one of them. That's fine. However, we have to recognize that the hormones are doing a very important job for so many systems. Our brains, our neuro function relies on regular ovulatory cycles. Our thyroid relies on that. Our relaxation and ability to have calm, our ability to grow muscle, to lose fat. So there's this certain important mechanism that hormones play in our body that's so much more than just, making babies or having a regular reproductive cycle, but it all plays together. It all plays together. So sometimes I create these simplified kind of examples, but it's only to illustrate that at the end of the day, that's what our body wants to be able to place to do. And to do that requires a lot. So kind of going back to your question, it really is no different if you're a man or a woman. A lot of people don't actually talk about the fact that men crush their reproductive hormones when they maintain being lean for an extended period of time. Just like women have what we call hypothalamus pituitary ovarian dysfunction, or functional hypothalamic amenorrhea is a term that gets used a lot that I don't always agree with that, but essentially what it means is you're not creating an environment for the proper signals to be sent from your brain to your reproductive organs back to your brain. That feedback loop you've interrupted because you're under so much physiological stress. And that over time has an impact on your ability to recover from it, and also your ability to maintain your athletic goals. That's a big piece. You start to see women all of a sudden that they might have gone from show to show to show, and they might not have had that menstrual cycle from show to show to show. And all of a sudden now their hair is falling out. Yeah. They can't lose any more body fat. They start gaining weight. And they're going, well, I'm no longer that athlete, but what do I do? For men, it's the same thing. It's like, what do I do? I want to have kids and my sperm count is 0. Yeah. What do I do?
It's kind of interesting because guys and girls get lean to try and be attractive. So, but yeah. It's like it's the other way around. You're getting leaner and you're messing with your reproductive health.
Yeah.
Wow.
And some people's bodies are more resilient to that, right? Like there's a lot that goes into that from your genetics and then the environment that you put them in at certain very critical growth phases. So for the human body, there's certain critical phases that our body is creating certain pathways, certain connections. And it's not just with our reproductive cycle. It can even be with our ability to sense pain. There are certain trajectories we have in our timeline that actually allow us to develop the proper roads, for lack of a better metaphor. It's like road work. We're literally paving these roads. And so for some individuals, they might have certain things that have kind of just these little tweaks that have gone off along the way. Say they had pneumonia as an infant, and then they had to be put on, certain types of corticosteroids. And then that kind of shifted and altered in their genetic framework. And now they don't absorb certain nutrients the right way. And then, maybe they're 13 years old and they get put on birth control, or they have a car accident that leaves them with a head injury that then influences their brain's ability to send signals. And because they don't have that proper framework because of that, episode with pneumonia and how their body reacted and responded, now they've got this other little bump in their body's ability to recover, restore, and maintain normal physiological function. So you start getting a bunch of these little bumps, and it gets harder and harder and harder to recover from certain types of triggers and stimulus, whether that is a hypocaloric diet, whether that is overtraining, whether that is overcoming a certain infection or some type of other ailment or disease. And so really for us as athletes, it's reminding ourselves that stress is inherently inhibiting for our body. Athletic performance is inherently inhibiting for our body because it is a stress at the end of the day. You going into the gym when you're like in your off season is still a stress for your body. You're asking yourself to break down, and then you're giving it the right tools to build it back up again. And it's not just with food. It's with sleep. It's with proper digestion. It's with proper coping mechanisms. It's with things like breathing. There's so many things beyond what our industry has decided you need to build a body. It's not just the gym in this one little box and supplements in this other little box and food in this other little box. You need so much more than that And so if we start to kind of reframe athletic performance like that, you actually need a regular ovulatory menstrual cycle to be able to be the best athlete you can be at the end of the day.
On
not
that, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say one question. If you've, say, been a competitive athlete, and your menstrual cycle stops, how long does it take to almost get back on track, or does that vary massively between women?
I don't have a number for you.
Wow.
You know, sometimes, and that's where that resilience comes in. It's like when you are going through your reproductive growth, right? Your puberty period, and you've had a relatively regular ovulatory menstrual cycle for an extended period of time before you lose it. For many times, women can get it back relatively quickly. If they haven't had a regular, healthy ovulatory menstrual cycle for an extended period of time, it's harder for their body to go back there because it doesn't know where it's going. So whether that is that they were, say, on birth control, whether that is they just have certain types of, I call them derailments. So whether that is, say, they have endometriosis, or they have some type of cysts that develop, if they have other types of, they have hypothyroidism, that their bodies go to is dysfunction. So how do we get it then to function again? That's not where it wants to go. And so those individuals, it does take a lot more to get things to come back to having a regular ovulatory cycle. And for some individuals, I hate to say it, like this is kind of the anti-speech I'm going to say, having a regular ovulatory menstrual cycle is just not in their cards. Yeah. There are some individuals that genetically and environmentally, for their body to do that, it might not be the healthiest for them because they're an uber complicated case. But that's not the majority of individuals. I mean, that is like 0.5% of the people I work with. That is so few and far between. But that's because all of us are different. The spectrum of human difference is massive. Yeah. So at the end of the day, though, it comes back to like, I don't know. I wish I could tell you. Women come to me and they're like, I want to compete in 6 months. Can I get my period back? And I'm like,
no idea. Oh, geez.
I don't know. Or I want to have a baby, but I haven't had a period for 6 years. And I'm like,
yeah,
we can try. We're going to give it our best shot. But for some individual, getting that back naturally, i.e. not utilizing any type of bioidentical hormones, is very difficult and takes time. For other people, they have been in such a state of dysfunction for so long that you're carefully pulling out these pieces of this very kind of like messy knot of all this different rope and threads. Like you're carefully undoing this in a way that they don't completely lose their shit and can become, depressed because they're not able to look the way they want and feel the way they want because they've been there for so long. I often like the way that I kind of phrase it to a lot of people is like, you're on the same team as your body. So you got to start treating it like that. You've got to start nurturing your body all along the way. Because if you're not, when it starts to get hard, you want your body to actually work with you. And for a lot of women, they are fighting uphill backwards because they not only might say have menstrual issues, they also have emotional issues about their body image. They might feel the perception that they need to stay lean, huge amounts of stress, lack of self-confidence and self-esteem and everything else. And those things aren't going to help you regain your menstrual cycle. They're going to make it harder. Yeah. Those are stress at the end of the day, and your body senses it as that.
So the perfect storm would be being put on birth control at an early age, then being a competitive athlete, then deciding I'm not going to be on birth control. I want to try and have a baby or fertility and trying to get it back because, so much has gone into those first formative years. It's going to take a while to rebuild, as you said, the road back to where you need to be, homeostasis.
Yeah. Now throw in an eating disorder in there. Throw in early childhood sports specialization. Say they were a football player as a young girl. Throw in some genetic abnormalities, and we have ourselves my 9 to 5 consulting practice. Like that is really what I work with a lot of. And that process is something I think we all as coaches, athletes, we need to respect what we put our body through. That's what I mean by we got to be on the same team as it. And also lay out those realistic expectations of like, we got one body. That's all we got.
Yeah, it's on that coaching. How can coaches assist in assisting their athletes in one, training around the menstrual cycle to get one peak performance, but also with health, trying to balance health as well?
So that is one of my favorite questions to squish is, should an athlete's training be programmed according to their menstrual cycle? I loathe it. You know why? How do we do it if we don't even know what the heck is happening on the inside? Because a lot of those ebooks and programs, or even just descriptions of what estrogen is doing and progesterone is doing, is based off of this archetype of the perfect menstrual cycle that happens every single month like clockwork. That is not reality, and that is especially not reality for most athletes, because we are putting our body through so much stress every single day throughout our athletic career. So it is the most unrealistic approach to training. Now, I am all for training for an individual. And if that individual has a menstrual cycle, cool, we can work with that. But just on its basis of like the idea, and there's so much of this stuff floating around right now. It's built on so many key assumptions, like that women have this predictable, stable menstrual cycle, that reproductive hormones follow the same scientifically proven trajectory every single cycle, that hormonal fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone result in the same net impact each cycle. You see these training plans that say, hey, go more for strength during this phase, and go more for endurance in this phase because your estrogen is high and you've got this type of like metabolic function happening as a result of that. And it's like, that's hogwash.
Yeah, I read that. I was telling you about it.
Yeah, it's hogwash. It also assumes that every menstrual cycle is going to be ovulatory.
Yes.
Yeah.
It says that the changes in ovarian levels of estrogen and progesterone are critical to performance. We don't know that. That there is not proven science on that. It assumes that all women are the same. And it assumes that there's actual research to support this practice, and there's not. There's simply not at all. And so, like I mentioned, like even that diagram that I see, and I mean, anybody can, if you just Google like menstrual cycle or phases of menstruation, and you look at, there's like these little peaks and valleys. I've actually had coaches that are like, oh yeah, I developed a training program based off of that. And I'm like, but you don't actually know what's happening. You just Googled this. You saw the estrogen was apparently higher in the first half, and progesterone is higher in the second half. Then you Googled what estrogen does to your muscle or your strength or your speed or your endurance. You Googled what progesterone does, and then you call yourself, an expert and write a program and sell it to the masses. I'm like, but you're based this whole thing on a myth, like that relationship. Like, so just to give you guys an idea, in a normal ovulatory menstrual cycle, estradiol, which is the form of estrogen that we're talking about, it peaks to about 240% above its low. So it rises about 240% from its lowest place. Progesterone is about 1,400% increase. If you Google, you're going to notice that estrogen and progesterone with those diagrams look like they're rising the same amount.
Wow.
That's in an ovulatory cycle. So now let's talk about when women have an anovulatory cycle. What's happening? Let's talk about when women have, say, a increased luteal phase. What's happening? Let's talk about when they're amenorrheic. What's happening? It's different. So we can't base this utopian training cycle around it, because we're ultimately just doing a disservice to our athletes. What we can do is we can get our athletes to start tracking their menstrual cycle. We can use that data of whether or not they are ovulating, how they feel. You know, I've been doing this a long time, and I can say I have some women that are rock stars premenstrual. They are like epic with their strength and their energy and everything else. I have other women that are like zombies. They both have ovulatory cycles. They're both healthy. But that's just them.
Yeah.
That's how their body responds. I have some women that it changes cycle to cycle based off of everything else going on. I have some women that are like, I do not want to squat when I cramp because my uterus feels like it's about to fall out of me. And I'm like, I get that. I'm going to listen to you and what your feedback is and not what my little cute program is telling me to do. Because no matter where your hormones might be, if you have, say, increased blood flow to your endometrium and you're feeling it, you might not actually have proper pelvic floor strength to be able to do that exercise in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
But if I put my blinders on as a coach and I just go like, oh no, but you're at the optimal phase to do this like 3-rep max test, I'm failing. Like I am failing this whole plan of me trying to actually create a good athlete. So my biggest piece of advice for athletes and coaches is to actually track biomarkers that are important to understand the ebb and flow of an individual's menstrual cycle. Learn the athlete and build your own data.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to begin to understand this on a more theoretical level, go to the research. Do not go to the internet web of, Instagram and start looking at all these cute programs. Go to reproductive physiology and learn about, let's learn about the endocrine signals. Let's learn about what a reproductive cycle looks like in an individual. Let's learn about some of the science behind it so we can apply that to our individuals we're working with. Rather than reading some type of blog post about the menstrual cycle that's not even giving you correct information because you're not doing your homework and then you're not applying it to that individual. So another big thing is that, yes, we have our menstrual cycle, but we have so much else going on. And men and women alike, we have so much going on that as coaches, we need to be paying attention to. We can't just be thinking, oh, women have our menstrual cycle, therefore we can create this training program that's like a 2-week on, 2-week off kind of deal. And then they deload during their bleed. And then we go back to the beginning. And, as women, it's like menstrual cycles do not define us. So don't make them define our training.
Yeah.
They do not make us a greater or less athlete. They are part of our blueprint. And that's cool because men also have things that are part of their blueprint, and men and women alike have more things similar than dissimilar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's start to program for the individual. If I had an athlete that was, say, in university and doing exams and their stress level was through the roof, would I be doing, let's say, a peaking cycle for powerlifting during that week? No. I'm going to listen to them and know that their stress is incredibly high. They're probably not eating properly. They're probably not sleeping properly. So would that be the best for them? No. Even if I've done this beautiful, undulating, periodized 12-week program, and that's where it's supposed to be. If that's not optimal for that person, it's just not optimal. And we need to know that and adapt. The only way we can adapt is if we understand what we're actually doing. We understand the information and ideas behind it. And that idea of athlete-centered coaching, for me professionally, that is a big piece of what I do and what I'm trying to get across to people, because that truly is how we can create sustainable athletes and healthy athletes. Because like I mentioned, performance is inherently inhibitory.
Yeah. We're
breaking ourselves down. So let's actually start building ourselves up. And each of us are different. We come into this world even with difference. So we have to start acknowledging that. Even the phenoms, the people that you're like, oh my God, you were born to compete. And they still have these derailments or they might be at their prime athletically, but maybe mentally there's a lot going on that they have to work through that's actually not great for their performance outcomes or their longevity. So we have to look at that whole thing together as coaches. And kind of just to reiterate the fact with women, it's knowing that, yes, we have these hormonal fluctuations that happen. Yes, we have them, but they should not be debilitating for us. They might cause shifts in our performance, but so does that exam period. So does that breakup. So does that, inability to eat a meal because you're rushing from a job to another job. Those also impact our performance. So let's not put all of our eggs in the menstrual basket, but let's still know that we have one.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And yeah, I think it's, like you say, just to know about yourself more, like you say, to track your temperature and just build this picture up. And yeah, for all the coaches listening as well, like you say, the perfect program just doesn't exist. Things just get in the way. But yeah,
that's the thing. As we always say, personalize every program, because you do it anyway. And this is no different. And this is also, probably indicates why you should work long term with a client as much as possible. Yeah. So you can personalize the program. And this is why when clients jump from coach to coach, it becomes harder for a coach to understand that bio data.
Absolutely. And honestly, I also think the greatest relationship that we can build is the one with ourselves. And so as an individual coming into a say coaching relationship and being able to say to your coach, like, I'm totally going to own this one because this was me back in the day. I'd be like, you are really good at what you do, but I know that I know me more than anybody else. So let's talk about me. And then you can, do what you do, applying it to myself. But you have to be able to own your difference, and you have to be able to talk to your coach about it and feel open to talking to them. And if you feel that your coach is not open to talking about, let's say, the fact that you have endometriosis, or the fact that you have, for a male, even no libido, if you cannot talk to your coach about that, that's probably not the best coach for you. And that's okay. Yeah. Move on. Or if it's because it's a social taboo, break it through. Maybe instead of having that conversation verbally, do it by email. A lot of times people are a lot more comfortable and receptive to these things when they can type it out versus talk it out. I actually recommend that to a lot of male coaches, is that hey, if you're going to do a survey for a female athlete on their menstrual cycle, do it digital, do it hard copy. Because if you want to get good information, because we know this stuff is still very, very taboo, you've got to open up that door to actually do it. And a great way is through doing either paper survey, or doing something like a digital survey, or even doing just an email questionnaire back and forth. And then that, at least, you have that box too that says, are you comfortable talking more about this with me? Yeah, check box, yes or no. If they say no, then be like, another question, are you comfortable talking to your physician about these issues? And then you as a coach can make that recommendation of hey, I noted that, we don't need to talk about this. I'm really grateful that you've provided me this information. It's really going to be helpful for me for programming. However, I strongly recommend that you follow up with some of these questions you might have with your physician. As a coach, that's all you can do. You're not a doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
Stay in your lane.
Yeah.
I've been doing this a very long time, and I have seen it all in my years in terms of coaches that have tried to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and all these crazy things, and then those that are ignorant, and then those that pay attention to the minutia, and those that make women feel because they have a regular menstrual cycle. I've really seen it all. And so that, though, for women, for men, track your data, learn your data, track your data. And I have no problem sending you guys a basic menstrual cycle diary that you guys can post with the show notes of some basic things to start keeping an eye on. It's old. I am old school as it gets, actually. I am pen and paper, but there are crazy apps out there apps only work if you understand why you're tracking certain variables.
Yeah.
If you don't understand what that means to have a migraine premenstrually, that app's not doing you very good.
Mm.
So you have to be able to understand what's happening. That's why I say, track it, go back to that literature, go back to that information. As a coach, also one of the big things I recommend people do is do a little case study. That's how you learn.
Yeah.
I mean, as women, we got it lucky because we can case study ourselves, and that's like the best thing we can do. But for male coaches, talk to a female friend or a client that you're comfortable with, or a sister or a partner or whomever, and be like, hey, do you mind me like asking you some questions about your menstrual cycle? Once you as the coach can be like, okay, so this individual, let's say she's got a regular bleed, but she doesn't know if she ovulates. She's got some cramping that's mild premenstrually. She's really regular, but she does notice that she's really tired. Take that information and now go look into what's up. Look into like, well, if she doesn't know she's ovulating, what do I need to put in place to help her understand that?
Yeah.
Let's start to understand more maybe why she's having cramping and if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Well, Victoria said on the podcast that a little bit is okay. So, let's ride that out for a couple more months and see if it goes away or see if she's continuing to get it. Let's see what's happening with that energy. She said she felt it last month, but wasn't sure if it was there the month before. So let's track for it. So it's a really easy tool that as coaches can begin to decipher and uncode and learn and ask questions. And as individuals, they probably will greatly appreciate you asking rather than just having, the ignorance is bliss kind of stance on it.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great to have that. Yeah, up with a pen and paper.
And I was thinking, I'm sure a lot of your clients are bodybuilding, female bodybuilders who have expert coaches who've probably messed them up. Yeah, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. Even, like I work with athletes from all different walks of life. And I also work with a lot of non-athletes as well, and your everyday people. But the athletes that, and especially in the last, I would say 5 years or so, are those that have even those that have respectable coaches.
Mm.
The coaches that at first I was like, oh, they don't seem so bad. And I'm like, whoa, like you did what?
Yeah, they're just experimenting with the client. Oh,
that's scary.
very.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and we see that with medicine too. I mean, I get some women that come to me and they tell me what their doctors suggested. I'm like, they did what? They want you to do what? So, whether it's coaches or doctors alike, it's, there's just so much we don't understand. And it's being open to that, but then it's also creating that knowledge that it's driven by data, like actual data, not like the fake shit we have in sport medicine on female athletes. So going back to the physiology, the science, the bare bones, and then building up this new knowledge base. I mean, that's really how we can restore and create better knowledge. And then going back to the individual, I will always stand true to that one.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much more like the whole coming off the pill and other steroids, but
yes,
that's a whole different topic.
It is. It's its own beast. And even things like, menstrual cycle dysfunctions, right? I find it's often easier to talk about not the perfect menstrual cycle, but to talk about when things go bump, because that's a little bit easier for people to wrap their brains around, because that perfect menstrual cycle doesn't really exist. I mean, in theory it does. I've got a written description of the perfect menstrual cycle, but how many of my individuals I've worked with over the years have that? Few and far. And if they have that, often there's other stuff going on that it has to be worked through in its own time.
Yeah. So interesting. And then maybe Andy will hunt you down again for another.
Absolutely. I love what you guys are doing, because you guys are building this knowledge at the ground up, right? And it is so cool to be able to be on this show with you, because it's exciting. As somebody, I've been in the fitness industry for 15 years. So I've seen huge shifts in the North American kind of like Western fitness culture in the last 5 to 7 years, I would say. And as a woman, especially, like, I was in the gym culture before it was cool to train weights, right? But we still had that fitness culture. We still had that idea. So for you guys that you're at that ground level, so cool. And you're doing it the right way. And that is awesome. Like, I mean, that's like, I sometimes wish I could be like to the Western world fitness culture, like, let's just start over.
Yeah.
let's just, let's just press the reset button. I wish that with medicine too. Let's just press the restart button. Unfortunately, then we wouldn't actually know where we went wrong. So I'll take the BS as, as it comes and try to just do better for the future. But it is so cool to see what you guys are doing.
Well, we're so grateful to have you with all your knowledge come on, because we were like, well, we could talk about it, but we honestly don't know. Like what you've said is so interesting. I feel like I should have been taking more notes, but we'll have to re-listen to our own podcast.
I've been in the classroom just writing notes down.
You've bust a lot of myths and misconceptions and preconceived ideas there, and
and helped a lot here now. To a lot of women relax, think, looking, and stop looking perfect.
That's a big thing.
Well, and I think to kind of leave a parting piece of advice would be that optimize what you have going on, optimize where you're at. If that's, that really is, I think almost every talk I've done over the last 5 years, I have like this slide that says the foundations, because ultimately, if you're not doing things like sleep, if you're not doing things like stress reduction, if you're not exercising in a more of a moderate controlled environment, it's okay to turn it up sometimes, it's okay to turn it down, but I'm just talking about the day-to-day. If you're not working on ways to, reduce chronic inflammation, if you're not having fun, if you're not having good coping strategies, if you're not trying to reduce your total like toxin load, if you're not having, I know you guys talked to one of my colleagues, but regular bowel movements for gut health, if you're not having, if you've got a bunch of nutrient deficiencies, if you're not breathing properly, which most of us aren't doing, if you're not able to, eat, or if you are, one of the things you can focus on is just eating in a sustainable, healthy way. No quick fixes, no diets, no, just eat good food. If you can do all of that, and you can do that for more than a couple of weeks, do it for a couple months, that is your foundation for success, whether that's athletic success, whether that's menstrual cycle, whether that is just living your best life. If you can do that, and of course there's more, but that's just some basic, and that was like 12 things. If you can do that, you are going to be off to an amazing start. Now, if you also start tracking your certain biomarkers, menstruation, you sleep, performance, basic stuff, we've just built a second floor to your house, right? We've got the foundation, we've got the first floor, we've got the second floor. Now we just have to do the finishing touches. You are already an optimal athlete. That is cool to know that. So instead of looking for fixes, instead of looking for certain pills to make your cycle regulate or just go back to the basics, the things that make us a really good functioning human being, get those in place, put them in place for a little bit, take that step back and assess. Because if at that point in time, say you've known all those 12 things for, let's say, 3 months, and there's still some things that maybe aren't functioning the way that you'd like them to, now you have a place to start. You can be like, okay, now I can actually go and have a conversation with my doctor and be like, I'm doing all of this stuff. Can we run some labs? And your labs are going to be a hell of a lot more accurate than if you don't do that.
I think that's such good parting advice for everyone. And, everyone can do that. That's not going to cost you anything. That's just
breathe, people.
No, well, that is fabulous. Have enjoyed that so much. Yeah, I don't know if we'll be able to sleep now. We're all sort of-
Yeah. Why?
Oh no, I know. I'm all about sleep hygiene, but then I'm like, you guys are gonna go to bed now. So
It's about what meal to eat. I've still got a meal to eat. And,
Yeah,
shut up.
I'm not eating.
well,
that's where your breathing comes in, right? Get yourself
Yeah.
back down into that Zen state.
we will go and meditate with the dog.
Yeah, if I eat that last meal, I'm not sleeping till late, so that'll be pushed to tomorrow.
Oh,
No, I talked to a client about that yesterday for like an hour. So you're ahead of some of the people I work with on that one, where they just try to push it. You know, sleep is queen or king. We need that. And if we don't have that, we break down faster than anything.
Yeah.
sleep in. Well, thank you again so much, Victoria.
You are most welcome, guys.
Yeah,
Your
thank
writing
you.
goes well.
Thank you.
We will be
Thank you.
vibes to your.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It will be done soon enough. So it's, you know, the hard work is done, and now it's just the writing, and ultimately this is the type of stuff that gets me motivated to sit down and write, because I know the sooner I finish writing, the sooner I get to go back to doing more of this.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
Well,
Thank you
good.
so much.
Thank you.
you guys are welcome.
Good luck.
Thank you. Yeah.